Bien, bienvenidos nuevamente. Enseguida los invitamos a escuchar a la doctora Courtney Bell, quien presentará la exposición Usando la evaluación de profesores para mejorar la enseñanza. Courtney Bell es investigadora en el Centro de Estudios de la Calidad de la Enseñanza del Educational Testing Service, ETS. Posee un doctorado en currículo, docencia y política educativa de la Universidad Estatal de Michigan y es licenciada en química de la Universidad de Dartmouth. Al finalizar su exposición, los asistentes pueden hacer preguntas a Courtney Bell a través de las papeletas que se les entregó y que serán recogidas por los asistentes de la sala.
Buenas tardes. Loud. Thank you, especially to the Catholic University of Chile, and in particular to my colleagues at MIDE UC, and most especially to the translators in the back of the room. I am embarrassed that my Spanish is so poor that I cannot speak to you in Spanish, so they will have to help all of us. It's very exciting to be here today. I'm greatly honored to listen and think and learn about the Chilean system. I think Paolo really helped us see in the recommendations from the report the tremendous work that has occurred here. You are much further ahead in many ways than we are in the United States. So you have many strengths to build upon. I hope that my talk today will help you just think flexibly. And in our discussion, I hope we will be able to talk a little bit back and forth about possible ideas as you think forward in this country about the kinds of revisions you might like to make to your teacher evaluation system. For those of you who don't know what ETS is, the Educational Testing Service is a non-profit, big testing company in the United States. It's actually a global company. We make TOEIC and TOEFL. We do not own the SAT, but we make the items, some of the items for the SAT. The GRE, if you have gone to graduate school in the United States, we make the GRE. I know very little about all of those assessments. I do not study any of those assessments. I study teaching, but those test fees that some of you in this room have paid pay our salaries as researchers. So we are able to do foundational research, and I am able to do foundational research on the measurement of teaching. So thank you for those test fees. My goal today is to share some research findings with you. They put the research findings at the very end of the day, so I will try to keep you invigorated, but we might have to bring more coffee in. I am not an expert on Chile, so I will stick to what I know, which is much more the U.S. context, and I hope we can work together to make whatever connections make sense, and think together. So, I am from Michigan. ETS is not in Michigan. I work in my home office, and I fly on a lot of airplanes to go to ETS, which is in New Jersey. But I should tell you a little bit about myself so you know what you're getting. I am a former high school teacher. I did Teach for America, if you are familiar with that program, an alternative certification program in the United States. So I taught in rural North Carolina amidst the tobacco and cotton fields in rural North Carolina. And then I was a teacher-educator for a number of years at two institutions of higher education, the University of Connecticut and Michigan State University. So I trained teachers for a number of years and I loved that work, and very accidentally ended up working for the Educational Testing Service studying teaching. So I come to you having spent really the last 5 years of my professional life studying instruments that are used in large-scale teacher evaluation systems in the United States. And I have been advising 3 states in the U.S. about their teacher evaluation states. You know, in the U.S. we are allergic to central authority, so all all of the states get to decide what a teacher evaluation system they would like. They invent it all, which is lovely for the consultants of the world, maybe not so good for the taxpayers of the world. So I have a good deal of experience thinking through some of the operational concerns and measurement concerns. But being a teacher, I think often from the perspective of a teacher. So that's the knowledge and understanding I bring to the table. I am, as many of you in this room I have learned over the course of the day, are committed to the improvement of teaching. In my current work, we are trying to figure out how to connect these teacher evaluation systems with the improvement of teaching. And like in Chile, these two things are not well connected in the United States right now. I owe a lot of thank yous. I am up here speaking, but without the help of many people, I would not be able to share these research findings with you. So much of the research that I will share with you today was funded by the WT Grant, Spencer, or Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations. There also have been many, thousands, teachers and administrators, mostly school principals across the country, in 11 districts or municipalities that have assisted in this work and will contribute to the data that I will share with you today. And then I am really blessed to work with both smart and kind colleagues, and their names are up there for you. If you were to go searching for some of the articles that we have written, you will see long lists of teams of people. It has been a great joy for the last 5 years to work with these colleagues. So, a little bit of an overview. I'm going to tell you a tiny bit about the teacher evaluation context in the U.S. just so you can understand the place where I'm coming from. I will share with you a theory of use that we have been working on at ETS to try to go from information in a teacher evaluation system to the improvement of teaching and learning. I'll share some of these findings. I'll focus actually on observation systems today. And then I'll come to this question: can teacher evaluation improve teaching? So a very brief history. About 5 years ago in the United States, and it is that short, it really is only about 5 years ago, we had teacher evaluation policies in almost all states that were what we would call perfunctory. They were based on, most often, dichotomous checklist. The teacher meets a certain expectation or the teacher does not meet a certain expectation. Very few gradations of quality, very small, I would argue unimportant things being measured. And in general, school directors did very frequent observations. Both teachers and school directors in this widget effect report reported that teacher evaluation was not helpful. They did not learn anything from it. And in fact, it did not reflect the quality of teaching in the school building. So what we would say in the U.S. is this is one big waste of time. In addition, there was almost no feedback for teachers, right? So if everyone sort of is getting good check marks, everyone meets, and it doesn't happen very often, there's not a lot to learn from such a system. In general, all of the teachers were highly successful teachers. More than 97% were proficient. And in general, and I understand now that I've been in Chile a whole 4 days, I understand that you have a similar expression in Spanish. We have a history of a closed door profession. And so in general, in our teacher evaluation system, those doors had remained closed. School directors did not go into the schools, into the classrooms rather. It was not a part of their regular work. They were more managers, administrators, dealing with, does the bus come on time? Is there the right food in the lunchroom? Who is going to be watching the children when they're outside playing? Those kinds of issues were the big, keeping parents happy, those were the big issues. So that is where we were. This report, the widget effect, came out, and a number of things happened, not only because of this report, but this report in a lot of Americans' minds sort of triggered much of this reform in teacher evaluation. So the federal government, across administrations, we had a change of presidents at the time, across administrations, did a number of grant opportunities to the states where they tried to create incentives, very lucrative incentives for states to do what the federal government wanted. So they would give you a lot of money if you would do what they wanted, and that was implement a certain version of teacher evaluation. And that version of teacher evaluation included student achievement, which I will get to in a moment, and Paolo spoke about this morning. The state governments, in fact, in order to even apply for that federal money, many states had to change their laws, which is what they did. So they changed rules about tenure, about compensation, about licensure. Licensure in some states became linked to yearly evaluation. You couldn't get your permanent teaching license unless you had good yearly evaluation. So there was a big flurry of changes in rules and regulations. The philanthropic foundations in the United States poured money. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was just one, but there were other foundations also pouring money both into research and into advocacy. And then finally, there were folks that were fired up about, excited about changing teaching in the United States. And so they wrote newspaper articles, they were interviewed on television, and encouraged people to dream bigger about what was possible. And their solution was teacher evaluation. So where are we now? We have a range of systems across the states, but in general, there are multiple measures, not unlike the Chilean context. There are multiple measures of teaching quality. So the first one in our states, it depends on the state, but it can count for roughly between 15 and 50% of a teacher's evaluation, that top one, student achievement. It's done in a number of ways. You heard Paolo talk this morning about value-added measures. Student growth percentiles are another kind of derivative calculation that are done for teachers. All of these are based on tests, standardized tests, like SIMSE here. And then for the non-tested grades and subjects, we have many of those. Something between 70 and 80% of teachers in the U.S. we cannot calculate a value-added score for or a student growth percentile for. So that's actually most of the teachers, right? So we use these other approaches, and one approach is where the teacher designs the objective and then creates some assessments or borrows some assessments and tries to set some goals for her students, and so that's what goes into her evaluation. A second kind of component that is in a number of systems across the country are student surveys, made very popular through the Measures of Effective Teaching study, the MET study that the Gates Foundation funded. And those in general are asking students for ideas, they agree or disagree on those, 4 or 5 point scales, strongly agree all the way out to strongly disagree, about certain kinds of behaviors in the classroom. So that for example, that their teacher holds high standards for them, or their teacher explains things multiple ways, or their teacher cares about me, those kinds of things. And some states are using those, though we do not have a research base to support their use in a high-stakes system. There are states that are using them. We do have some systems that include lists of professional activities, things like participating in the second grade curriculum team, those kinds of professional activities. They get written down and you get credit for those. But the biggest one, and in most cases it's almost half of the evaluation, is observations. And observations hold this kind of privileged view in the United States, in part because teachers and school administrators feel that you sort of have to be in the place with the people to know what it is like. So they have what I would call, as a measurement person, very high face validity. Teachers and administrators feel that they know what is inside those observations, right? We'll learn very quickly from the findings this is not so true, as it turns out, but that is the deep belief in the U.S. These various kinds of measures I would argue, are not detecting the same thing. Now that's a kind of counterintuitive statement, right? How is it that measures of student achievement are not kind of detecting something we might call teaching quality. Isn't that the same as what the observations are trying to detect? But let's think about this for a moment. Let's start at the top of the diagram, up here. So for the psychologists in the room or the students of psychology, we think about teaching quality, and we very deliberately mean teaching quality, not teacher quality. Teaching is interactional between teachers and students, and content. I mean subject matter when I say content. Teaching quality is what we would consider a domain. A domain is a big thing, right? And it is made up of constructs. Here they are. On the left-hand side, the teacher ones, knowledge, practices, and beliefs. And on the right-hand side, student knowledge, practices, and beliefs. Now, these are very big categories still. This is a very high-level, very imperfect diagram. It's helpful to us to think about with respect to the measurement of teaching because it helps us remember these are not all measuring the same thing, and we must be careful when we use measures sort of interchangeably, or we talk about them with one another as professionals interchangeably. So if you look down here, we could have different kinds of measures of teacher knowledge, for example. So you could have a knowledge of pedagogy. You could give a teacher a test of that. Do they know how to do group work? What are the main theories behind how to put students in small groups and work? But there's also a notion, for those of you who enjoy Deborah Ball and her colleagues, content knowledge for teaching is another kind of construct of knowledge. It's the knowledge that is necessary for teaching that is in addition to regular content knowledge. You could have a test for that. We're working on tests for that. We design tests like that for the MET study. But then you can think to yourself, well, we have some teacher practices and some student practices, and some of these different kinds of things, the portfolios that you all have here in Chile, they're measuring some of both of these things. They're not only measuring one thing about the teacher. We might have an interesting discussion about that. In the U.S. context, our portfolios do not measure just the teacher. You could imagine creating a portfolio that might, but in the U.S. context, they do not. And these observations, when you sit in the back of a classroom, for any of you who have done that, you know you are paying attention to the interactions between people. And so, of course, you're measuring, for example, the discourse patterns or the language patterns that students use. That's a student practice, right? And the language patterns the teacher uses, the content that is available for students to learn, those are the interactions that we see. So we call that both teacher practices and student practices. This is the contentious side in the U.S. These measures of student achievement are hotly debated, both among researchers and policymakers in the United States. But so you could have various kinds of measures of student achievement, some that are much less contentious than others. Now, today I'm going to focus relatively narrowly on observations, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how observations are being used out in the world in some places that are trying to do them both differently from what I'll talk about right now and differently from how you all use them. So I'll give you yet a third way observations might be used. These new systems we have designed or are in the process of redesigning in the United States really hope to overcome these shortcomings of the checklists and infrequent feedback and sorting everyone and saying everybody is above average. Overwhelmingly, the new observation systems are using the kinds of rubrics that you have on your handouts. I will say more about them in a moment, but they tend to be rubrics that are holistic in nature. They require more inference when the observer is making a judgment. It's not as easy as are people smiling, or is the objective written on the board, or did the students efficiently go collect their books from the front of the room? The kinds of judgments being done now are much further away, more similar, I think, to what you are used to here. But going hand in hand with that, most of these systems have increased the amount of training for these observation rubrics. And that is because, which I'll say, I said a little bit about the principles a moment ago, but in general, our principles, When you are selected to be a principal, you are not selected because you were an amazing teacher. You may have been an amazing teacher. It's possible. But in general, you are selected for your leadership skills. You're selected because you raised your hand and said, yes, I would like to be a principal. It's a very hard job in the United States. In the public sector, there's very significant accountability pressures. Lots of good teachers choose never to be principals. But in general, principals are very organized. They're problem solvers. They would describe themselves that way. They are problem solvers. And while those are crucial skills in school leadership, they are not the same skills as being able to carry out a conversation with a teacher about how to improve her practice, right? And so we have had to do in the United States a tremendous amount of training of school administrators to try to help them learn to see teaching and learning and learn to have conversations with adults, other teachers, about how to improve their learning. So we have moved to this new system in the U.S. That is supposed to, like your system, guide both human capital decisions. Those are the tenure, promotion, compensation kinds of decisions. That's what I mean by human capital. We want these new systems to serve those goals, and we want them to serve the improvement goal. So we are similar to you in that way. Now, for the measurement folks in the room, those are very high demands. And Paolo argued you cannot ask those things of the same single system. You have to break it in half, have two strands, two themes moving forward. We haven't figured that out yet, Paolo, in the U.S. We're still on one. So let us think, though. We can worry about the accountability later. You've heard a lot of accountability talk today. So let us focus on connecting these teacher evaluation systems, and we'll work with observations as a case in point. You could put any measure in there, though. It could be the portfolios. You can put whatever measure you like in there. And we'll try to work through this theory of use from the scores or information, we'll say, down to improvements in teaching and learning. So let me walk you through this quickly. If we start at the top, and by the way, this is just one theory of use. People in this room could come up with much more interesting ones, I'm sure, and we could come up with alternative ones about how the accountability functions of a teacher evaluation system might work. But this focuses on the teacher learning and the professional development functions. So if we begin up at the top, an observation system needs to create information. That could be numbers. They could also be the notes that the school administrator takes when watching the lesson, let's say. So the system needs to create information about the level of skill. So where does it fall? What you just saw, where does it fall? Not necessarily overall, but along certain dimensions, on the questions that were asked, on the respect that is in the room, etc. The engagement of the students. Now, unless you believe that teachers are secretly holding back their very best teaching. They know how to teach really amazingly well, and they're just not doing it. Maybe they're doing it with their children at home, but they're not doing it with their students at school. Unless you believe that, then the next step has to be true. This information has to create new insights. If you presume that they're holding back their best teaching, then we're in sort of a motivational theory of use, that the scores and the notes just motivate somebody to get going and do better teaching. It's probably true that for some very small percentage of teachers that is the case. But in general, that is probably not true. In general, most people need to see something differently about their teaching from the information in the system, in order for them to then keep moving down the steps. So in order for them to then learn something new, they make use of those insights, and this is where the professional development comes in. Now in the U.S., that professional development is often actually conducted by the school leader. Sometimes it is conducted by the municipality. It could be something as straightforward as a new textbook that the teacher learns how to use in a different way, let's say. It could come from a week-long session on how to do group work. So wherever that may come in, the teacher has to learn something new. The teacher then, in that fourth step, has to actually incorporate it into her teaching practice. That's a trick, by the way. We have a lot of research in the U.S. to suggest that doesn't happen easily. It takes a lot of practice over quite a long time to help teachers actually take something new and use it on a regular basis in their classrooms. And then finally, if all that works properly, we then would hope that this new, more effective teaching that we're seeing in our classrooms would result in student learning. So there are a lot of spots for this to fall apart. I am going to focus for the remainder of time on the first one only. Do we have evidence that these evaluation systems can create accurate and reliable information about the quality of teaching in a classroom through observations? And again, I mentioned why I'm going to focus on observations, because they seem very important for the improvement of teaching in particular. And to the point in the Chilean context, we've heard people talk today about the issue that people don't feel that they get rich feedback, maybe from your portfolios yet. Maybe that's something you'll choose to work on. It is the same thing for observations, right? We need there to be a way for somebody to see what areas of strength and weakness there are, and that then can help the teacher improve her work. So you should wonder, well, why do you care so much about accuracy and reliability, right? So aside from the fact that that's sort of the coin of the measurement realm, there are at least two reasons. The first is really quite simple and actually has legal implications. If we're going to make judgments about people that have consequences, whether that is the amount of money they make, their extra $100 or 50 pesos, or we're going to make decisions about their tenure, we should care very much that the system is fair and valid. That's an ethical sort of standard as a profession we should meet. And then the other one is a little bit practical, right? And this is, by the way, what I'm about to say could be viewed as contentious. We'll return to it at the end. In that theory of use, our hypothesis is that if we don't have accurate and reliable scores, we won't actually see any of the other steps happen, because the scores will sort of be meaningless. The words written down on the page won't help anybody have any kind of insights. Now, that's actually an empirical question. Perhaps you could have inaccurate information. I'm going to tell you a story that's sort of interesting at the end in one of our municipalities around exactly this issue. But what I can say to you is in the U.S., previous to all this reform, that was the case. Everybody agreed. Great reliability. Everyone agreed. All the teachers were fabulous. But that was inaccurate. We knew that they weren't, and that's what that report that I showed you at the beginning told us as citizens, as researchers. We knew that what we were seeing in our classrooms was more variation in quality than what was showing up on the teacher evaluations. So that's the other reason we have the hypothesis that the system needs to be accurate and reliable in order for it to help people learn. Let me say quickly what I mean by those words, accuracy and reliability. So accuracy is the idea that the degree to which observers assign scores that expert observers would assign. So you should decide sort of who your experts are. I know that people in Yulan's group worry very much about how to create expert scores and train people to be experts. We do not want scores to be based on who scored them. We want the score to represent some little t truth about the teaching, and so it shouldn't matter who scored them or when they were scored. Shouldn't matter if they were scored by video or it was a live observation. We want none of that to matter. We want it to be something that is meaningful across all of those things. Reliability is the idea that the degree to which scores are free from these influences, right? And these are the ones that I was just mentioning. So what have we found? Into the findings. I'll tell you a little about the studies in the moment, but this is the high-level view of the findings. So we have found, in fact, that observers vary in the consistency of their judgments in the research studies as well as in the real world when they're working in real accountability systems. In fact, they struggle to accurately and consistently judge aspects of teaching. They struggle most with the instructional aspects, which is kind of a problem because we want them to work on those most importantly, right? It's okay if we can agree whether or not the class was well run. That's good. It's necessary, but not sufficient for the improvement of learning. We need people to be able to say, those questions with those students were helpful and those other ones were a little less helpful. And so we see with our observers, they really struggle around the instructional aspects of teaching and learning. They do not agree in general. They do get more accurate over time. You can train these observers to do better and agree more and be more accurate, but thus far, with our current training systems, they remain below acceptable levels of reliability. The good news is they judge teachers very similarly whether or not they saw the lesson sitting in the back of the room live or they were watching it on a videotape. That one's a little counterintuitive. We didn't expect to find that one. We sort of thought there would be a difference. I'll say more about that, though. But I'm going to argue for you today that we have a little bit of evidence to suggest that these struggles cannot simply be blamed on the individuals conducting the observations, and they cannot only be blamed on the training system, that in fact, these disagreements about what counts as quality teaching, the struggles we see when people are trying to judge instruction are the result of the systems we have in place, some that are historical. So in fact, when we go and we look, in fact, principals do not agree with each other any more than they agree with the experts. We have a saying in the United States that we know good teaching when we see it. You will often hear school directors say that to one another. Oh, we know it when we see it. I'll share with you some evidence that that is not the case, at least not in the one district that I'll share evidence from. And the second area where we have some evidence is, in fact, teachers and observers do not agree about the quality of instruction that's happening in their classrooms. So there's a disconnect between what teachers see and understand in their classrooms and what outside people see and observe. So that's the overview of all the findings. Let me tell you a little bit about these studies. There are 4 of them. The first one has about 450 teachers in grades 6 through 8. English language arts, and mathematics. The second one is about 82 teachers from a single very large school system, and that is middle school and high school algebra, which is a foundational course in the U.S. for mathematics. The third study is the MET study, where there are more than 3,000 teachers from 6 almost exclusively urban school districts in grades 4 through 9. And all 3 of those first studies are very similar. They use multiple measures, and they are comparing across the measures to try to understand what we can see and learn from those different measures. The 4th study that's there is done in Los Angeles, which is a very large, city in the U.S. And when I emphasize the very large part, it's larger. That school system, that municipality's, the number of principals, there's about 1,200 school directors in that system. That is larger than many states in the United States in terms of the number of schools being served. So it's a little mind-boggling, to tell you the truth. When you're a researcher, when you're there, you're overwhelmed with how huge the system is. But in that school system, we have been studying, to Mario's earlier point, we have been studying the principals and how they are learning to use the observation system. 2 of the instruments that are used in those studies are on your chair. And I've shared just a little small piece from the CLASS instrument, the Classroom Assessment Scoring System, and the Danielson instrument, which you're very familiar with here. There are also 2 instruments that I won't talk about today. One is a math-specific observation instrument, MQI. It belongs to Heather Hill and her colleagues at Harvard. And the other instrument is called Plato. And that instrument belongs to Pam Grossman, who is a faculty member at Stanford University, and she studies secondary English teaching. So those 2 were used just in English classrooms and just in mathematics classrooms. So now, across these studies, we were using these observation protocols, and they have a very similar structure. So they have a number of domains. You can see there at the top for class, there are what we would call 3 domains: emotional support, instructional support, and classroom organization. And class, you can look at your handout. Class has 7 points, but it's only anchored in 3 places, so low, mid, and high. The raters are trained in class to select a score, but if they are 1 off from the score, they are still considered in agreement with the master raters. And then Charlotte Danielson's framework for teaching uses a 4-point scale that's on the other side of your handout. And though there are more domains in Danielson's framework, these studies only look at 2 domains. They're only looking at the classroom environment and the instruction that's happening in the classroom. There's a planning domain and there's a professional domain. We don't look at those in this study. So what you have in front of you are not the domains. You have dimensions, which is the smaller grain size. So perhaps, I don't know if this will translate well into Spanish, the domains are like grapefruits, and the dimensions are like oranges. They're smaller. The raters score dimensions, and then we, through various scoring schemes, average up or aggregate up to domains. So you are looking at these dimensions. And the ones you have in front of you, for framework, it comes from the instructional domain, that's the grapefruit, and that's using questioning and discussion techniques. And these are chosen specifically so you could kind of see the difference between the 2 instruments. These 2 instruments are meant to be used across grade levels and across subject areas. So in theory, you should be able to use these 2 instruments in a music class and also in an algebra class and also in a kindergarten class. The class dimension that you have there is quality of feedback, and that dimension goes inside of the instructional support domain, and that's the one I told you that the raters struggle with. So I should note for you, I'm going to report on first just research studies, and I view these as a best case scenario, to tell you the truth, which might make you nervous when I start to show you the findings. These raters got a lot of training, and they were required to certify on the instrument. They had to take a test. And actually, in the MET study, every time they logged on, and it was all video scoring in the MET study, every time they logged on for a 4-hour scoring session, they had to pass another test. So these folks were we kept them on a very tight leash in these research studies. All of them were former teachers or had experience with teaching. And this is critical, I think, for the folks in the room who know how challenging it can be to have hard conversations around performance. You don't have to be a teacher or a principal to know how hard it is to have conversations around people's performance. These raters did not have any relationship to the teachers they were scoring, none. They were never required to give feedback. And in the research studies, there were no consequences for anyone, not for the raters, not for the teachers, not for the schools. So this is a best case scenario for accuracy and reliability, right? Like you would think, we're turning these little raters into computers and they're supposed to be watching the video and assigning the scores. Okay. That, of course, is not true in real life, but so this is a best case scenario in our view. So just so that you can see what the scores look like, on the left you see the class protocol, and on the right you see the Danielson protocol. They really tell the same story. So if we begin with the class instrument on the left, the figure shows that the overall average score for teachers on each of the instruments' domains. So you see emotional support, instructional support, classroom organization. The scores on emotional and instructional support were sort of in the middle of the scale. If you want to sort of think, okay, well, how good is that? Go ahead and look at your quality of feedback dimension, and you can see what the teacher would be doing and the students would be doing if they got kind of a 3 or a 4-ish, right? The same thing is true with Charlotte Danielson. Now, we do see a pattern here. The highest score in class is the classroom organization. Those are things like, are students on task? Do they have activities to do? Are they reasonably behaved? Are they productive? That's what goes into classroom organization. Same thing for classroom environment for the Danielson framework. And you see there that those are both quite high. This is in contrast to the movie images we see in the United States about disorganized, chaotic, crazy classrooms. In general, if I were to sit you in front of the videos, the hundreds of videos I've watched in the last 5 years, that is not what you would notice. What you would notice is the students are sitting there quite still and compliant. I would say sort of shockingly compliant. What you would also notice is it's very boring. Very, very, very boring. And one of the raters said to me once, "Oh my God, Courtney, I feel like I'm in 7th grade again. Oh, it's so boring." We were watching a grammar lesson, how the subject and the verb. So the level of instructional quality is the lowest of the ways that we measure in the United States, and it's very mediocre. So we know that the instructional interactions from that last slide are generally scored low, but were the individual scores that the raters created accurate and reliable? Now, that's a good question, and if you're a quick reader, the answer is mostly no. So let me walk you through the slide a little bit. You see on the left side both class and Danielson's framework with the domains there. Now you say, well, why is it 23-37? We calculated agreement rates. There's lots of ways to calculate agreement statistics. For this slide, we calculated just exact agreement. So if Yulan and Courtney gave quality of feedback both a 3 on the very same lesson, we would be considered in agreement. If Yulan gave it a 4 and I gave it a 3, we would not be considered in agreement. There are way more sophisticated ways to do this, but this gives you the message in the simplest form. So these are, you can see, for example, in emotional support, the dimensions, the oranges, that go into that big domain. At least one was at 23% agreement. This is very, very, very bad. And all the way up through at least one dimension, that was 37% exact agreement. You can see in classroom organization, we do see some better agreement. This is the part where I mentioned to you we have an easier time teaching people to agree on that. But in that middle column, you see agreement between raters, and in the right-hand column, you see the agreement between master raters and raters. So you can think of that last column as the accuracy, because we're presuming that the master raters are the experts, and so we want the raters to be agreeing. The only good news I can say from this slide is that we don't see huge differences in those two columns. So, and the only way we can get that last column is in a testing kind of a situation, in those tests I mentioned that they log in and they have to take a test and then they're allowed to score. So we see similar performance, not exactly the same, but similar performance by the raters. So that gives us a little hope that the low levels of agreement we're seeing are really low level, they are truly low levels of agreement. Now, lest you think the raters are just maybe clueless, they are not. The scores are not capricious. In general, raters are sort of tracking one another and the expert. So let's go to the left-hand cluster of bars over there. So what we see here is when an expert gave some part of the lesson a score of a 2, this is on class, gave a score of a 2, you can see just about 40% of the raters would have also given that segment of the lesson a 2. And you can see a whole lot of raters, 37-ish% would have given it a 3. So unfortunately, you see there are a few 6s out there, though. That's a little concerning if the master rater gave it a 2. But you can see these are forming they're tracking across these groups. You see in the middle when the experts gave a 4, in general, the raters were clustered around the 4. And the same thing on the right-hand side. When the master rater gave the 6, you can see most of the raters gave the 6. So a single rating, what you should conclude from this is a single rating had a lot of variation in it in these studies. But you can, of course, average across observations. You can have multiple observers observing the lesson, and this is how you can make this problem that we're showing be less of a problem. You can get better, more reliable scores that way. Now, reliable scores shouldn't depend on who scored. They also should not depend on when they were scored. So this is a very interesting slide. We have a new paper about this. So we were able, because we both scored live and scored by video, we were able to pull the scores apart and disentangle the time of year that the lesson happened. It will not surprise you to know that in some prior studies, people have found that around the holidays, like around Christmas time, let's say, or around the end of the school year, scores tend to go down. You don't want to be observed right before vacation. But we wanted to pull that effect apart from just how raters learn over time. And so this slide helps us see that. At the very beginning, these are scoring days along the bottom of one of the studies, the second study. And you can see, on average, this is a fictional average. Mario, I think, used a fictional average, or maybe it wasn't Mario, used a fictional average teacher. They don't exist. But an average teacher on the very first day of scoring would have gotten just over a 5 as a total score. This is on class again, but you can see it rapidly drops off. You should say to yourself, Why are the raters giving worse scores as time goes by? Seems very interesting. We can talk about that. And then it kind of bottoms out there around 100 days of scoring. And it starts to come back up. And you should say, well, is that a big deal that it goes down that far? Is that a big amount to drop? And that's why you see the 75th percentile and the 25th percentile. In fact, it's quite a big drop. So that teacher, that average teacher, if we had just watched her that once, that score would have ranked in just about the 75th percentile on the first day of the study, the first day of scoring. But later on, it would have been down toward the 25th percentile. So that's a big drop. And concerning for us as people who are trying to train raters to be consistent over time. We find, this is from class, but we see similar patterns in Danielson. We actually see similar patterns across all the observation protocols. Another potential source of disagreement is this video live comparison. I will not say a lot about this. We have a very elaborate, very technical paper about this, and it is asking the foundational question, could I watch a teacher by video and could I watch them live, and would I roughly come to the same conclusion? And the answer is yes, mostly. You mostly would come to the same conclusion. You would rank order those teachers that you watched live and by video almost identically. The correlation very, very high, over 0.97. But you would give a little bit higher scores if you scored them live, but everybody would be higher. You would have scored everybody a little bit higher, not just certain teachers higher. So that's good news. They're interchangeable if the absolute score doesn't matter to your purpose. So to sort of summarize a little bit, a single rating from a teacher in these research studies, we were just watching a single lesson, and by the way, for you all, there were no other documents surrounding that observation. There was not a lesson plan. This is literally just the observer watching the video. So there were not a lot of supporting things that could help us make decisions as raters. So a single rating in this situation would be sensitive to who conducted the rating, when the rating was conducted, but not whether it was done by live observation or by video. We found that even with experienced raters continued to be a source of inconsistency, but when we began to average across raters and lessons, we were able to improve the reliability of the ratings. Now, up to this point, all of the data I've shared are from external researchers, right? And research studies that do not have to help anybody improve anything. There's nobody's job on the line in these research studies, including in the MET study. But when we go out into the world, into real systems, we find somewhat different things, and we see somewhat important, what we think are important inconsistencies among actors in the system. I don't know if this will be similar in Chile or not, or if you will nod your head or say, no, it's quite different here. But in general, we have found that principals don't agree with experts or each other about the quality of teaching that they're seeing. In general, teachers do not systematically agree with experts. I'll show you a slide where we can, it's a pattern we're beginning to see in the U.S. where principals actually give higher scores, quite a lot higher scores than what quote-unquote experts or researchers would have given. And together we think these demonstrate a systemic problem that cannot just be pinned on one actor in the system. So this slide can help you see where we looked, this is in Los Angeles, where the principals were taking the test. Los Angeles certifies their principals. They're required to go to training for 1 week, and then they have to certify on this very elaborate, actually, test. They watch a video, they have to score the lesson plan, they do a lot of things. So you can see this is a version of Danielson down the left-hand side. That's what they use in Los Angeles. It's aligned to the California state teaching standards, but it's very similar to the general Danielson framework. That second one has kind of a funny name, but that's classroom environment. That's more the management things. In the middle row there, you see agreement between the principals and the experts. Some of those look a little better than that earlier slide that I showed you. Some of them don't look good at all. A third of the time, there's only 4 score points, so random guessing, in theory, would give you 25% agreement, right? So just if you randomly guessed which one, because it's a 4-point scale. Now, in the right-hand column, you see agreement with other principals, and some of those numbers are very, very unnerving, right? 17% agreement between 2 principals watching the same lesson, and in that case, it's looking at the same lesson plan. 10% agreement about what the score should have been. So this was very concerning to Los Angeles, and they've now put in place a set of steps to work on this. I'll tell you about those in a moment. We also see this disconnect among actors between teachers and quote-unquote experts. So we asked a number of teachers in that algebra study to rate themselves on the domains of class, and we gave them definitions that map onto the observational components. And what is very, very interesting here, let me show you what this is. On the left side with the blue right here, those are the raters. You can see the raters score the teachers just above a 4, but the teachers score themselves right around a 5. And if you look at that class protocol, just even that one dimension, you can see 5 is looking a little bit better than the 4. It's edging closer to that 6 and 7, that high score point. What is very fascinating for us, I told you that the classroom observation scores overall in these studies tends to be higher, and emotional support and instructional support tend to be lower. You can see that in general, teachers think more highly of themselves than the experts in these two emotional and instructional domains, and they actually rate themselves lower on classroom organization, which is sort of interesting, right? So we could talk about this for a very long time. We've actually talked about it with the teachers that produce these data. But one of the things, just a very simple conclusion to draw from this study is there's clearly a disconnect between what an outside observer sees in the classroom and what the teacher herself perceives about her teaching. And if we care to improve teaching, it's important to build common ground from which to have a conversation. We have found that when we compare research findings in the very same districts as real, actual data in the real teacher evaluation system, we find a very large disconnect in the judgments of quality. So these data are taken from one of the studies, though this pattern is literally identical across the studies and across instruments, this distribution of teaching. And so you see on the left-hand side, this is framework, this is Danielson's framework, ineffective, developing, proficient, exemplary. Those are the 4 categories, 1, 2, 3, 4. You see the study distribution, so this distribution is created by the raters. And then you see in Georgia, the state of Georgia, they are using their own observation protocol. They certainly wouldn't want to use one that anybody else was using, a good local control state. And you can look at how that distribution is shifted, right? If you think about the message that goes to teachers from a research study, the message from this study would be 3/4 of you are developing or needs improvement. In this system, which is the real system, 6%, right? This is very different. 74% are proficient in the real system that's actually happening right now, and 24% is what the observers would say. And, fully 1 in 5 classrooms are excellent. The teaching happening is excellent. So this is another example where we see this disconnect between what experts would say, and I'm not going to argue about I will not make a strong argument to you about which one is right here. This is a very interesting question. I don't have data to bring to bear on that question right now. But I will say this disconnect between what researchers see, what quote-unquote experts see, and what people in the field are willing to give one another as scores, again, is evidence that we have some work to do to build some common ground. So very quickly, these new observation systems are challenging. We know from the research studies that single lessons, good rating, accurate, reliable ratings on single lessons are going to be difficult to achieve, and that, in fact, raters in general do not agree with experts. So I've shared a lot of information with you about classroom observation. And some people think to themselves, I thought the observations were supposed to be better than those student achievement scores. What does this mean? What should we be using then to measure teaching, right? What do we do now? If observations are unreliable and if the student achievement measures are unreliable and not ready to be used, what should we be using? This is what practitioners will say and policymakers will say to researchers in the United States. But before we jump to the conclusion that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, I want to share... So do not do this. Don't cry. As Hernan said, we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I love that. That is true in policy, right? So let me tell you a little bit about some pockets of hope. One pocket of hope I've already said. You can average across observations, ratings, raters, and that starts to give you some more reliability. So that's hopeful. But there's more hope. I've focused up at the top just on accuracy and reliability, but you shouldn't believe me that that hypothesis. You should question that hypothesis, that the scores or the information must be accurate and reliable before anything else can happen. And you should question me because I'm going to tell you some examples where there are not accurate and reliable scores, and in fact, there are some good things happening in the middle. So, in Los Angeles, back to the story from the study where there are real human beings working with real teachers under real consequences, we see these pockets of what you might think about as hope or positiveness. So, for example, we see high school principals. In Los Angeles, you have just a single school director and what you might think about as assistant principals, helpers. They have different roles, but in a number of high schools in Los Angeles, the principal and the assistant principals realized, we do not know how to do these observations. We better figure it out. And so they changed their administrative schedules so that they could get through all of their classrooms over quite a long time, about a 4-week cycle. But they would do observations for about 40 minutes. They divided up in pairs, always in pairs, the principal and somebody else or 2 assistant principals. They would co-observe, they would talk about it, and then they would score. And this system that they developed in these few schools, we've heard about this, is a way for them to develop their capacity. Now, they've had to make the observations very short. They do not have time to sit there for an entire lesson, so they do these things that they call walkthroughs. So that's like 10 or 15 minutes, but they are using a common observation protocol. So even though they are observing something very short, they're still sticking with the rubrics that the district or the municipality uses. So they're gathering evidence sort of around the same things all the time, and that's a huge stride forward for them in Los Angeles. So that's a practice that they've been able to implement. It didn't cost any money in those schools that are doing it, and it's a way for them to build capacity. Another little bit of positive hope is we hear stories, only stories right now. We're working on collecting the data about this, where principals are talking to other principals. So Courtney will call up Yulan and say, I have this teacher and I cannot seem to get through to this teacher about how to help her ask different questions in her classroom. I've tried it this way and that way, and we're just not really getting anywhere. Would you be willing to take a look at the lesson with me? Will you come with me? Sometimes the principal can say, yes, sure, I'll come. Other times they can't come, but they discuss different approaches. And the other principal might say, Yulan might say, Courtney, try this. This is what I tried. That kind of conversation was almost non-existent in Los Angeles prior to this teacher evaluation system. Increasingly, the principals are demanding better professional development courses for their teachers because they feel a lot of pressure. They want to be able to help their teachers, and it is true, to someone's earlier point, they, as a part of the principal evaluation system, they are held accountable for helping their teachers improve. And so they are demanding now from the municipality better professional development. There was almost no or very sporadic calls for higher quality professional development prior to the teacher evaluation system. We see at the elementary school level some teachers, discussing actually their observation results with one another. It's not a lot, but there is some of those discussions happening. They talk about the feedback they got. They share some strategies about how they might do it better. This is optimistic, right? And then we see the central office or the municipality trying to learn. They brought in a number of external consultants for about a week and a half to teach the central office staff how to help the school directors with coaching. And so now the municipality central office administrators are trying to help the principals learn how to coach adult learners. So all of these things, now they're not widespread. I cannot make that argument. We're working with 42 of these principles in depth, and then we have data on about almost 900 of them. But these are practices we hear reported just from these 42. So we're working to try to document the degree to which those practices I shared with you are systematic. My hunch is they're not very systematic. But it does give you hope that you can work in the middle of that theory of use without there necessarily being accurate and reliable scores. So, in the US, and I think this is different here because you all have made a lot of progress that we have not yet made. Jennifer Goldstein wrote this, and it's very appropriate for us. She says, designing a new structure for teacher evaluation is to interrupt a century-old and taken for granted institutionalized facet of school district life. That quotation gives you a sense of the gravity, the inertia of the previous system that we are now trying to intervene on. And this is why I think Armand's admonishment to not allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good really rings true for me as a citizen, hoping that things can get better. I have tried to stick with research findings thus far. I'm now going to venture off into opinion and professional judgment for one slide, if you will allow me. I don't have data that can support this. I think that there are a number of underlying issues. Maybe some of them will resonate with you. And these underlying issues are things that must be attended to if we want to go from teacher evaluation scores to teacher learning and ultimately better student learning. So first, we have the problem of a lack of shared language. And we also have a lack of images of what high-quality teaching looks like because we've had the doors closed for more than 100 years. And so when Paolo says, those were great questions that teacher was asking, I say, huh? Really? The teacher answered all the questions herself. She never let the students answer. What do you mean they were great? Maybe they were great for the teacher. They weren't very good for the students, right? But we do not, Paolo and I would not have a video, prior to this work, we would not have a video to argue about that with, right? We would just be sort of arguing the abstract, or we would have seen a lesson together and we'd be arguing out in the hallway. We couldn't press replay on that video. And so that lack of a shared technical language, the lack of images, those are two places that we can work systematically. And I think, I don't know, again, professional judgment, I think if we work in those spaces, we will make it more likely that evaluation can lead to improved learning, teacher learning. A second kind of issue, I think, is the political will and the resources to actually work from the top of that theory of action down to the bottom. I don't get the sense this is the same here. I don't know. I'll be curious to hear from you. But in the U.S., we're a little bit fascinated by bright lights. We turn our head this way, oh, this is exciting. Oh, and we turn our head, oh, this thing, we should do that. We do not have a lot of staying power. We've kept the doors closed a long time. That has some staying power. But sticking with an idea or reform for any length of time requires wisdom and political will and resources, and we're not very good at that. So I think that is a place where policy might be able to help. We, unlike you, did not begin this teacher evaluation journey with consensus. In fact, it began on very contentious ground. There's deep, deep disagreements. In some places, there are agreements between the teachers' union, the administrators' union, the policymakers, but those are the exception rather than the rule. So there is a situation of distrust, and I can only speak for myself as a learner. I don't learn well when I don't trust the person I'm supposed to be learning from, right? I'm afraid, I feel vulnerable, I won't take risks, I do kinds of crazy behaviors. So trust is crucial to learning and improvement. So it seems like that underlying issue of trust, policy actions we might take that will improve trust could help work down that theory of action into teacher learning. And then finally, creating environments that are supportive of adult learning. in the United States, we tend not to think about the grown-ups, the adults in our education system as learners. We just don't. I'm not sure why we don't, but we don't. And it is to our detriment, because we then do not deliberately intervene to create learning opportunities for them. And it is through those learning opportunities that there stands to be a chance of change. So these, I think, again, no empirical evidence, I think in places in the United States where there's been more success, leaders have attended to some of these issues. They have gone slower, they've built consensus, they've been very careful about the language they use it consistently, like in certain states they use it for pre-service, they use it for in-service, they're trying to be consistent and coherent. So I think some of these issues, if we attend to them, we might see some more forward progress. I do think, to answer the question that I posed at the beginning, I do think that teacher evaluation can be used, in fact, to support teacher learning, but it is going to require patience and wisdom from policymakers, from school directors, from teachers, and certainly from parents. So I will stop there, but I hope I leave you with some hope that there is space to do this work, but I do think the work will be challenging for us. Thank you very much.
La primera pregunta es específica y dice, si las evaluaciones directas por parte de directores inflan los puntajes, ¿qué medidas de auditoría o nivelación de puntaje se pueden usar?
Yes. So the first question then is why? Why is there score inflation, right? We should before we try to fix the problem, we should try to understand why the problem is happening, right? So our research in Los Angeles suggests that it is complicated. I don't know if that is true here in Chile. It is complicated in the US for a number of reasons. One is principals, honestly, I do not think have strong visions of what high quality teaching is. So they actually think the things that they are seeing in their schools are pretty good. Now you should ask yourself, well, why would they think that? Now, in the US, it is true that in general, principals never go visit other schools and watch other people teach. So they too have the problem that they do not have a wide range of visions of good and bad teaching in their minds. And so if you have a principal that has always taught, let's say, in a single or maybe one or two schools in a single location, they have a very narrow view of what is possible. So one kind of answer is they too need to have their minds opened about what is possible and what high quality teaching looks like. So that's one answer. There is also the answer, we have found evidence in our qualitative interviews, there is also evidence that principals are managing a building. They are not trying to become perfectly accurate raters. That they truly do not see the task that way. They view the observation protocol as a tool to achieve their goals. And their goal is not to create the most perfect ratings. They do have as a goal helping their teachers improve, but that is a different goal than creating perfectly accurate ratings, right? So we have evidence from principals who have walked us through the teachers in their building that are being evaluated. And they will say things to us like this. They will say, oh, I have 15 teachers. On all 15 of those teachers, I have to do 3 observations. This is way too much for me. I can't squeeze this all in. I do not have enough time. And so I am going to focus on the ones that really need my help, that are just bad. They're bad for students. I'll give them all 3 observations. These other ones I will give maybe 1 or 2 observations, and the ones that I think are okay without me, maybe I'll stop by a few times, but I will not observe them. So the principal, another kind of answer is that the principals are distributing their effort across their teaching staff because they are responsible for the whole building, right? And so this then creates some inaccurate scores. That's another kind of answer, and I'll just give you a third kind of answer, which is the following. It's the one that probably is most intuitive to you.
I have had a principal say to me, you know, Courtney, I know that Sarah is not the best teacher, but she's okay. The kids love her. The students adore her. The parents adore her. She brings donuts every week for the staff meeting. Treats, right? I'm just simply, she will be devastated if I tell her she's not doing well. I'm not going to do it. And that statement is about managing a staff. It's not about creating accurate scores. It's about understanding there are larger goals at play for a school director than only the creation of accurate scores. So I will stop there. Those are three kinds of answers, though. And so I think those three things have to be dealt with in different ways. They are not all the same problem.
Courtney, las dos preguntas que siguen tienen que ver más o menos con lo mismo, con el tema de la diversidad. Es decir, ¿cómo se enfrenta? Yo imagino que se está pensando en el contexto de la evaluación, el tema de la diversidad en el aula, que en muchas aulas hay un porcentaje alto de estudiantes con necesidades educativas especiales o con problemas emocionales. Y la otra versión de la pregunta más o menos alude a lo mismo. ¿Sí?
If I had the answer to that, like the answer to that question, I think I would make $1 million today. In teacher evaluation, we want the evaluation to be sensitive to the challenges and strengths that the students and the school context bring to the teacher, right? So we want to take into account that one teacher maybe has 5 children with special learning needs and another 5 children that are learning, let's say, Spanish as a second language. You would like to be able to take that into account. I think the puzzle for us, both as researchers and as practitioners, is how do you do that without lowering your standards for what high-quality teaching is? I was chatting with ministry officials yesterday, and you in Chile are able to adjust for the school context, mathematically adjust for the school context. Mm-hmm. In the US, this is very unpopular because a few reasons, but the big reason is parents and advocacy groups say, no, 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 you are not giving any adjustments for these children are harder to teach, because if you do that, that will create a perverse incentive to not hold high standards for those children. So we have a problem because, in fact, if children are 2 levels below grade level in reading, that is actually a harder challenge for teaching, right? So we do not have a good answer for this other than to say, when we conduct these evaluations, the advice that we give to states is to be mindful that you do want to account for these differences in context. You want to allow there to be space. Maybe that's through the mathematical calculation. Maybe that's through exemplars that show different ways proficient could look, maybe in questioning. But you need to be creative and need to make sure that you allow for that. Don't try to stamp it out. It is happening and it's important. But in terms of the teaching thing, we could talk for many hours about how you deal with that as a teacher. It's a big challenge.
Buenísimo. Bueno, quiero agradecer a Courtney por la muy profunda y fundada información que nos ha traído sobre un tema que es, dentro del contexto de lo que hemos estado discutiendo, bastante clave, porque estamos todos mirando al aula como el punto central donde se juega la calidad de la docencia, y queremos estar lo más tranquilos posibles de que lo que podemos observar en el aula es una herramienta útil para el desarrollo profesional. Así que creo que ella nos ha traído aquí razones para estar preocupados y para poder entender cuáles son los desafíos que representa ese mejoramiento de nuestras formas de observar lo que está ocurriendo en el aula. Bueno, y esto nos lleva y nos trae al final de este seminario. Yo quiero partir ciertamente por agradecer a todos los que están aquí y han venido o que nos han estado escuchando a través de streaming. Para todos los que hemos estado aquí, esta ha sido una reunión extraordinariamente relevante desde el punto de vista del contenido, pero también muy provocadora en términos de con lo que nos vamos. Si alguien venía aquí con la ilusión de que íbamos a encontrar alguna respuesta fácil a los desafíos, creo que hemos concluido que la cosa no solamente no es fácil, sino que es bastante más difícil de lo que tal vez pensábamos en la mañana antes de comenzar. Y en ese contexto, yo creo que lo que Courtney nos ha planteado justamente, que alguien podría tomarlo de la manera más dura, es decir, dado que es difícil hacer buenas observaciones, entonces abandonemos el intento y hagamos como ella mencionó, en inglés lo dijo lo mismo que nosotros decimos, es que es como botar la guagua con la bañera, o sea, con la bañera. Entonces, lo que tenemos que hacer es que esa lejanía de la perfección, que es evidente en un ámbito tan complejo como este, no nos debe detener. Incluso creo que la experiencia que ella ha reflexionado al final de cómo a veces el modelo o la teoría de acción que inspira un sistema de evaluación puede no validarse completamente y pese a ello se pueden generar dinámicas positivas para los fines que se están persiguiendo. Creo que nosotros tenemos también evidencia y observaciones bastante consistentes con lo mismo a propósito de lo que ha pasado con la evaluación docente y el tipo de dinámicas que ha generado a nivel profesional entre docentes y en algunas escuelas con directores. Creo que nos vamos también con la convicción de que el director es un personaje mucho más clave. No lo mencionamos mucho en la mañana al partir como el personaje clave, pero si decantamos lo que ha estado pasando, sabemos mejor que para que se puedan desatar estos procesos asociados al uso formativo de la información disponible, el director es un personaje absolutamente clave. El informe que Pablo mencionaba en la mañana, este informe grande de los 28 países, justamente pone de relieve este aspecto y dice que junto con asegurar que en la formación profesional de los docentes existe un profesionalismo para asumir el uso de la información, lo que es absolutamente clave es un director o directores que entiendan que ese es su desafío y su norte. Estamos lamentablemente en esta materia un poco a años luz porque hemos hecho incluso opciones, las comentábamos a veces, como hemos disociado el rol del director de lo pedagógico al dejar la responsabilidad pedagógica en alguien que es una rareza internacional, ¿no es cierto? El jefe de la unidad técnico-pedagógica, no es algo común en el mundo y el director entonces queda con la sensación de que su rol es solamente administrativo, ¿no? Entonces creo que hay muchos desafíos por delante. En lo personal, yo creo que estos son desafíos que son entusiasmantes, no paralizantes. Creo que el norte que tenemos es súper claro. Tenemos que hacer todos los esfuerzos posibles para que este país resuelva de mejor manera el tema docente en todas las dimensiones que hemos mencionado, pero muy particularmente en aquello que está cerca del desarrollo continuo, es decir, de establecer mecanismos y dispositivos efectivos para crear una cultura orientada a un mejoramiento continuo de las prácticas en el aula. Así que quiero agradecer de verdad a nuestros invitados, por cierto, a Courtney, a Pablo, a todos los panelistas que estuvieron aquí y a cerrar ciertamente muy especialmente al equipo que estuvo organizando este evento que demanda un gran esfuerzo, mucho de lo cual no se ve, pero en particular a Carlos, gerente general de MIDE, a Lisette, encargada de comunicaciones, y a Yulán, gerente de Docente Más, que son las personas que realmente han hecho posible que hayamos tenido este evento este día. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Hasta luego.